Alright guys, Tyler down here at Emerald City Guitars with another amazing vintage Martin. This is a 1941 D-28 and it's about the cleanest one we've ever seen. Now, I think it's kind of easy to get desensitized sometimes to just how rare the pre-war D-28 is. I mean, every company out there makes some sort of reissue of them, God knows Martin does. There are entire companies out there whose sole purpose is to try to recapture the magic of the pre-war D-28. But the term pre-war D-28 is so ubiquitous in the guitar community that you'd think there was way more of these made than there actually was. But the fact is, they just didn't make that many of them. You know, from 1931 when they started making D-28s to about the end of 41 when some of the wartime changes started to take effect, Martin made around 800 D-28s. Now, if you put that in perspective with, say, something like the Gibson Les Paul Burst, you know, from 1958 to 1960, Gibson made about 1,500 of those, which means finding a pre-war D-28 of any year is about twice as uncommon as finding a burst. So if you want to find a 1941, they only made 185 of them, so that's almost 10 times rarer than a burst. So again, just not that many were made. And moreover, it's likely that a lot more of these Martins have been destroyed over the years just by virtue of being more fragile than a solid body guitar. So yeah, they're incredibly, incredibly rare. Now this extreme rarity might lead you to believe that maybe they weren't in that high demand at that time, but I don't really think that's the case. If you think, Martin's pre-war years just happened to coincide with the worst economic time the country had ever seen, you know, before or since. It was the Great Depression. Now, at a time when most people were struggling to feed their families, not a lot of people, especially hobbyists, had $125 to go spend on a new Martin guitar. Now, the few people who were able to afford this kind of price tag were generally professional musicians who could justify that kind of price, you know, because they're making back some money by using the guitar. You know, these guitars were built to be tools, and professional musicians use them as tools. It adds this awesome air of, like, I guess, authenticity to these guitars that you just can't fake. However, this authenticity often does come at a price, and especially with flat top acoustics, it can be a pretty severe price. Now, we all know, as players, flat top acoustic guitars in the modern era, they require regular maintenance, regular repair, and so forth. And this was always the case. The problem is that in the first several decades of these guitars' lives, well, basically up until the 80s, professional, tidy guitar repair was near impossible to come by. Now, any maintenance that these guitars did need was most likely performed by the owner, if not maybe a buddy of the owner, or in the best of cases, maybe a violin repair guy who didn't really have any knowledge of how guitars were built or their structural considerations or what they would need. Now, the result of these repairs, unfortunately, are often pretty horrifying. I mean, you'll see drywall screws driven through the bridge, you'll see cracks cleated with popsicle sticks. At that time, you know, if you had a cross-grain break on the top, you just put a giant bridge on there and an equally giant bridge plate on there and call it good. So before neck sets were invented, like in the 80s, the standard mode of operation would just be to plane the fingerboard down to almost nothing, lower the bridge as much as possible, and call it good. Now, of course, the case back then was that these are just used guitars. There was no need for any sort of reverence that we have for them today. And of course this is true, but it doesn't make it any easier for us to look at now. There are some real hack jobs, unfortunately. So you'll recall from earlier that in 1941 there was 185 of these D-28s made. Now, I'd estimate that of those 185, about 20% just aren't around anymore. They're lost in fires and floods, and sometimes just, you know, you back over one of the truck, you're just going to throw it away. So I'd say 20% probably aren't around anymore. Now, of that remaining 80%, I'd say, man, probably 65 or 70% have fallen victim to really, really regrettable repairs over the years. You know, mostly by well-meaning repairmen, but still pretty horrifying by today's standards. So optimistically, that leaves us with about 25 1941 D-28s that even vaguely resemble how they left the factory. And of those theoretical 25, this has got to be one of the cleanest few. So we got this guitar from one of my favorite vintage guitar collections I've ever had the pleasure to inspect. Now, not the biggest collection ever, but so carefully curated. All of these guitars just completely blew us out of the water, and this one was no exception. The only reason that this one was dislodged from that collection was to acquire a fantastic 1936 D-28. Now, that 36 D-28 was one of the best acoustics I've ever heard, and man, I was just as impressed by this one. Now, I could go on and on about how great this thing sounds, the tone, so forth, but we'll have a demo a little bit later, so I'll spare you. So 1941 Martin necks had the reputation for being a little bit thin, and when you compare them to mid-30s necks, you know, they are thinner, but I would not consider this a thin neck by today's standards. Probably more in the medium range. Feels the hand really, really nicely. It doesn't feel too small at all. One of the most amazing things about this specific guitar is that it is 100% crack-free. Now, if you know vintage Martins, you know how incredibly rare that is. Even the cleanest examples often have a pickguard crack, you know, here under the B string, or out on the outside part here, just from the guard shrinking. It's almost inevitable, but somehow this guitar has avoided that. And like I said, 100% crack-free. So I don't know if you can see from the video, this guitar does have a little bit of general play wear, but overall it is incredibly clean. The finish is just almost brand new. There's no overspray, no touch-up, no anything on this guitar. The bridge on this guitar actually has been replaced, but it is a very, very high-quality replacement. It's funny, the current owner actually bought this guitar from a very well-reputed vintage Martin dealer who advertised it as original, so that kind of speaks to how convincing it is. So the guitar recently has had a super tidy refret and a sensational neck reset, so it's playing like a brand new guitar and will be for another couple decades at least. So one of the big perks of my job is that I get to be around a lot of really fantastic vintage Martin guitars, and I'll say with no hyperbole whatsoever that this guitar, for a rear-braced D-28, it's as close to perfect as I've ever seen. So I can't wait for you guys to hear it. Luckily today we have Skyler Mehal in the shop who's going to sit down with it and show you just how amazing this thing sounds.